Marcia, thank you so much for speaking with us today for Black History Month. And you, of course, yourself have made history becoming the first black person to get the title of High Sheriff of Cumbria. You were the third person of colour overall across England and Wales to get a High Sheriff appointment. I'm really keen to hear all about your story right from the start. So you were born in London to Jamaican parents, and eventually you settled in New York. Why did your parents make that decision to move from London to New York?
You know what, as I start my story, I just need to thank you for the opportunity. I think it's really nice to be given a forum where my voice is heard. So thank you very much for that. My father was somebody who paid a lot of attention to the political atmosphere. No matter where we've lived, he's always done that. And in the 50s, things were not good here. My parents met and married early 50s. I was born early 50s. And it was a time of really unrest, and things were not nice for people who were black. My father made the decision that if he wanted his family, specifically his kids, my brother and I, to do well, he'd have to leave. Looking around the world, New York was the place that he chose. So we ended up in New York with me being a child, my brother a child, and we grew up, educated, and lived much of life there.
And you grew up during a pretty significant period of black history across the US.
A very significant time. You know, many of my friends my age will often ask whether or not I had the experience of being a hippie. It's during sort of those times. And my answer is always the same. I was busy being black. You know, grew up with the notion that I needed to be proud of who I am. And even though there was an awful lot of turmoil against black people, I needed to learn how to stand firm. And I did.
And you speak about that turmoil as a young woman or a young girl. Yeah. How aware were you of the racial tensions? How aware were you of this kind of severity of
Totally aware. There were protests all the time. Now, I live, first of all, in the north of the US, which is very, very different than the south of the US. That in itself is an advantage for somebody like me, a wonderfully diverse community. So I wasn't standing alone as the battle, so to speak, occurred. There were lots of friends all standing in solidarity. But, you know, many of the songs of that time, the music of that time, the poems of that time were all about learning to be strong, to know that things are against you, but your job is to really take care of you and be able to talk with confidence about who you are and what you want to do.
And you eventually moved from that part of the world, which, as you say, was quite culturally diverse, to one of the least ethnically diverse parts of the UK. So how was that transition for you, coming to Cumbria?
It was amazing. And by amazing, I do not mean it in the most positive way. I was shocked. I was really shocked. It didn't dawn on me. I mean, technically it should have dawned on me because I wasn't a kid. I was in my 40s, early 40s at the time. So I should have known. And I had visited only once. I had never seen cows and sheep. I had never seen mountains. I came from the city kind of thing, or a suburb of the city. So this was completely different. But also, I had truly never seen so many white people. So it was a shock to me. Now, I remember asking my husband before we got married whether or not I was going to have difficulty because I was black. And his response to me was, you're going to have more difficulty being American. And I will tell you, on some level, that's been correct. But on another level, it's been It's been hard being black, but I'm not quite sure how I would have managed it if I was younger. I feel as if I had a strong foundation, and that foundation carries me into being able to manage whatever it is that life gives me. If I were younger and not so formed, I imagine it would have been difficult.
So do you think, just going back to what you said there about your father's advice, the fact that you were coming from America made things even more difficult for you then?
Yeah. I think Brits in general have a love-hate relationship with America. On some level, they love bits of it, but on another level, they see Americans as quite loud, quite full of ourselves, not necessarily the best people to emulate. So it's hard. The way I speak, sometimes I bottom line people, meaning I get to the point much quicker than loads of other people do, can work against me. So I will say that through the 25 years that I've been here, I can say I've changed. I think for the good, I think.
I'm sure. And in terms of your experiences of living in Cumbria, a largely white part of the world, has that ever been quite isolating for you as a black American woman?
Totally isolating. You know what? It's totally isolating, but having said that, I feel somewhat lucky. And by that I mean I think people have given me chances that they may not have given other people. I can't explain why that's happened. But I think when I listen to especially some kids nowadays, it can be cruel for them. If it was cruel for me, and there were times where I was just shocked, not hurt so much, but shocked, I've always been able to manage it. Shocked meaning, again, I'm going back 20 plus years now, but, having people ask if they could touch my face, having people ask whether or not, being black means you don't sunbathe, you don't care about the sun. Wondering about things that really are so asininely stupid that you sort of think, why would you ask that? And figuring out the best way to handle it, because the reality is handling it in anger, which is what off the top of my head I might want to do, doesn't help me, it doesn't help them, and it's not the way I am. So taking the time, sometimes with humor, and explaining that certain things are not going to happen. You're not touching my face. You're just not. And explaining sometimes the differences between us, and knowing that differences are okay, is something that I would take the time to do. I also think, again, 20 years ago, up here, meaning in Cumbria, there were lots of questions about whether you're black or colored. I hadn't heard the term colored since I was a kid. So it was a throwback for me. In history, we learned a long, long time ago that we're black. And everyone here, no matter what offensive term they use, and I've heard the most offensive terms here, unfortunately, I will say it's not always out of badness. Sometimes it's just out of ignorance. But when I educate people about the fact that the term colored is not what I am, and not what we use anymore, I'm often given the history of it, and the fact that, maybe I have that wrong, and maybe that's how they did it in the States, but I'm here now. And if anything, I have to turn that around to remind people that I am here now. Black people exist, but they're black. They're not colored. And somehow you have to say that without appearing to have a chip on your shoulder, with a little humor. And many times, because I feel I can, I joke about it and ask them to use that term. And that sometimes is the most fascinating thing, because sometimes for the older population, they don't want to use that term because they feel they're being rude, because of their own history and what they've learned. So it's been an education all the way around, I find. Things have nicely changed.
That must have taken a lot of strength to kind of approach things in that way, using humour and a bit more of an educational approach?
I'm somebody who likes the end result. My end result is that I want you to hear me and I want you to understand me. And if I want that, I have always needed to use strength. You know, technically, being a female, you learn that you have to manage your life differently than men. Loads of people here think that I'm aggressive. I know I'm assertive. But that really does mean that I have to use all of that strength that sometimes people don't have to use. But for me, it exists every single day of my life.
We know that racism exists in all corners of the world. You mentioned there a bit about a certain ignorance. Do you think that perhaps the lack of ethnic diversity in Cumbria perhaps is a bit of a breeding ground for that kind of ignorance?
Yeah, because there are not enough people like me who will educate and who will help people understand the difference and also help what feels abnormal to them, meaning see a black person, be more normal. I used to hate going shopping, you know, meaning food shopping, not a big deal. I used to hate going other shopping also. Food shopping, it was just that I was stared at. I don't mean a little bit, I mean a lot. When I went into regular stores here, after a lot of frustration, I took the option of pinning a £100 note to myself because I needed people to know that whatever's in that shop, I can pay for, because otherwise it meant I was followed around. I would have been the most helped customer in a shop because as soon as you walk in, it's can I help you? And follow you wherever you go, which on the one hand can sound quite nice, but it's really not. And the other thing that I will say that still happens now is being ignored. I can be, it's funny, you talk about being seen, but at the same time being ignored. If I'm on a line, which means a queue, if I'm on queue, I find people just walk right in front of me. And I will, because I can't help myself, I will say, you know, you do realize I'm standing here. And they'll say...
Still happens now?
That happened last week.
Wow.
And I will say I'm standing here. Remember, we're doing a lot of queuing nowadays. So whether it's supermarket or getting into a bank, sometimes I'm online, as I say. So yes, I have to remind people that I actually am standing here. Gotta tell you, the only time I felt okay about that was reading Michelle Obama's book. She talked about being the first lady at the time, taking her 2 kids shopping, being on queue online, and people jumped in front of her. Now, she was the first lady, and if that can happen to her, of course it's going to happen to me. Made me feel a lot better.
I'm glad you mentioned Michelle Obama, actually, because I wanted to talk to you a bit about role models, because you naturally will be, for a lot of people, a role model. And do you see yourself in that way, and do you feel a bit of that responsibility?
You know what, I think all adults have the opportunity to be role models. I know, because I am in the forefront many times, I know I'm a role model. I assume that responsibility, but it has nothing to do with really being a role model. It has more to do with taking care of who I am. Role models are really important. Somebody like Michelle Obama. I've had loads of role models through my life, not all women, who have just taught me to stand strong and to say my 2 cents. Having a voice is really hard. It's hard to do, but having a voice is one of the most important parts of life.
Do you think there are enough people of colour in visible, high-profile roles?
No, of course I don't think so. No, I don't think there are. Obviously, you look at business, we're not there. You look at sports, except for playing, we're not there. You look at politics, we're not there. You, if anything, can hear everybody refer to the 1 or 2 people that exist that are of color or are of difference in some way. And that is great, but it's by no means the job done.
When you look at the events over the last few months, sparked by the death of George Floyd in the US, where you grew up, and you look at everything that's happened since, how does that make you feel?
Terrible. In general, terrible, because this sort of thing happened a lot when I was much younger. And I think, if anything, between political correctness and people calling out each other, a lot of it seemed to go underground a bit more. I think racism has become much more sophisticated, which means you can't easily put your finger on what racist act is going on, but it's still there. What was amazing to me, and what was totally different for me this summer, was that there were white people protesting along with black people. I have never seen that, and I was truly touched by that. In Carlisle, the protest, which I observed, was amazing in that, of course, they were paying attention to social distancing because we had to, but there were people of different colors. And I don't mean people of color. I think that made such a huge difference to me. Not what I would have predicted, and certainly not what I expected. I live in a place where, I believe black people, people of color, have to stand up for themselves. The reality is, we need other people. I need allies who are against racism. Anti-racist allies are really important because they're the ones who help this world change. I can voice it, but to make it happen, other people are in the position. So I need them, and I was truly, truly touched. I am touched when people get in touch with me and say, I have this idea, what do you think? It's great.
As someone who grew up kind of experiencing those racial tensions we spoke about earlier in the US, and looking at the events that are happening now, do you think we have seen progress, or we are seeing progress?
Oh, progress has happened. It has happened. And I would be really doing a disservice to everyone if I said nothing has changed. Things have changed. Looking at me, obviously things have changed in such a good way. The reality is, though, it's not enough. So much more still needs to be done. There are still many people who will say that institutionalized racism just doesn't exist. That I am really on a platform that has nothing to do with reality. And that everybody is really open, not prejudiced, not racist, which is just not true.
What would you say to those people?
I usually have a conversation with them. Recently had a conversation with a man who was 92. He did say to me that it's clear that I've got this wrong, very, very wrong. Reminded me that I must not know my own history because obviously black people sold black people. They are the reason why slavery exists. Black on black crime exists, which is why black people are more likely to go to jail. And my response to all of that is always the same. That may be true, because it is true. But the reality is that does not account for what we're talking about. And using him as an example, because I'd heard him speak before, I let him know, because we had had a long conversation. Takes time, takes patience. On a good day, I've got that. On a bad day, I don't. This was a good day. So we chit-chatted, and I said to him, I need you to understand that those racial slurs that you use are just wrong. They're not helpful. And whether you like it or not, they create prejudice. He disagreed, but since I said to him, I agreed that some of the facts you're bringing may be true, I said to him, you might want to accept some of my facts. No racial slurs would be a good way to start. Throughout the rest of his conversation, he was horribly cautious. And by horribly cautious, He knew I was standing there. He knew I was listening, but he was careful, and his language was more correct. I'll take it like that, you know. People know that because I'm in the room, I have learned that I can silence a room just by being in the room. But people know if I'm in the room, they might need to be a little bit more careful. I'm more than okay with that.
When you're faced with a conversation like that, a lot of people in that situation would find it extremely difficult to maintain that patience that you spoke about. Where have you learned and how have you learned to do that?
I'm in my 60s. I've had lots and lots and lots of years of being black. You know, I think one of my realities, and a lot of people will say to me, well, you know, it's not such a big issue, you know, you sort of forget it. But the reality is I'm as black as they come. So you can't miss that in me, which means every single moment of my day, that's a factor that I have to consider all the time.
Is that quite tiring?
Yeah. More than tiring, it's annoying. You know, so it's the people who know me most who get to hear me lash out at that, because I'm not always reasonable. And certainly I have my moments where I've just had enough of it. So I vent that, but I always vent it in safe places, because I need those words and my frustration not to be what I show in public. It's not helpful.
If you could look into the future in, say, 20 years' time, what would a perfect future look like for you?
Well, certainly a bit more diversity in Cumbria would be nice. You know, I actually think some of the things that I am talking about and possibly battling would be different if we had more people of difference, whatever that difference is. So if that could happen, you know, I've written articles for employers and business, how to attract more minorities to Cumbria. I think the university has changed things up here. Universities bring in people of difference. So I think if there's more of that, that in itself creates the change. I think that makes people stop and be a little bit more careful. Obviously, people are marrying people of difference now, much more than they ever did. It's fantastic. All of that creates change. But I will also always say, giving somebody like me a chance. If you had asked me 10 years ago, would I ever be black, a high sheriff who happens to be black, I would have told you you're on drugs, because that's just not possible. It's so nice to be wrong about that. It is so nice to be given something. I come from a place where I'm not given anything. Everything that I have fought for. I've known that if I want to succeed, I better be better than everybody else, because that is the only way I'm going to do well in this world. To be called and told that a group of people have considered me for high sheriff was just amazing. And certainly not what I expected. I remember saying to Jim, do you think this is just somebody who's, you know, fooling around with me? And, you know, but the reality is I knew the person who'd called, so I knew they weren't joking. But it was quite unbelievable.
You've achieved so much aside from that as well. We've not even touched on, you know, many of your achievements throughout your life. And from our conversation, you strike me as someone who kind of uses every experience possible to kind of learn and grow and develop. If you could go back to your 15-year-old self and give her one piece of advice, what would that be? You
know what was funny? Recently, I'm not, probably just because we're in lockdown, I had the time to go and look through some books. I found my high school yearbook. So I would have graduated high school 1972. For whatever reason, they made us write a letter to our future selves. I certainly didn't remember, you know, so many years on that I had ever done that. But I read that letter, and I was amazed that so much of what I felt I needed to do in life I have been doing. The letter was all about just knowing that the world can be mean, but I don't have to be mean. And that people can either show you their best or show you the worst, but my job is to always show the best and to try my best to educate but help people. But kindness is something that it doesn't cost anything. It takes time and it takes a lot of energy. So if I do that right, I will have done as much as I can possibly do. So having read that letter, I thought, it was pretty amazing for me to read.
It must have felt good as well to think you've achieved what you wanted.
It felt tremendous. By achieving, I couldn't write things and wouldn't have known I'd be living in England. Wouldn't have known that because I would have been a psychologist throughout my life. I just, use terms like I always want to do well. I always want to, I like nice, so the only way you can get nice is to make some money, which means you got to have a good job, you've got to take good care of yourself to do that. So I've always felt that was really important. Treating people like human beings is something that I should always do, no matter how somebody treats me.
So what advice would you give to your 15-year-old self if you could say one thing to her?
To just keep going, to always keep going. I think, certainly when I was 15, the obstacles were there bigger and brighter than any obstacles that anyone should really manage. But my advice would always be, no matter what obstacles are put in front of you, remember what you want. Go after it, because you can, and because you can achieve it. Along the way, you may make some friends, might make some enemies too, but if you make your enemies because you're standing up for yourself, that's probably the correct way to have an enemy.
Marcia, it's been absolutely fantastic hearing your story. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And again, for me, it's a great opportunity to be able to talk about things that for some are tough. I do worry about our kids. By our kids, I mean youngsters, because I think that they have the struggle that I've already come through. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for being here.